we're going to fundamentally look at the tragic downfall of the red pill community, how they went from being at the top of their online presence, from YouTube to Reddit to Instagram to Facebook, dominating their spaces and effectively radicalizing a lot of young men into the red pill ideology, to a complete tragic downfall where nobody hears about a community. Before anything, we have to obviously do a little bit of a definition or an understanding of what the red pill community actually is at its foundational core. At its foundational core, the red pill community is an online subculture of predominantly men with an incredibly toxic ideology, which is founded on the notion of gender dynamics and female hypergamy. Female hypergamy arguing that women generally have a proclivity or a tendency of dating across or higher up the social and economic hierarchy. They use biological and evolutionary arguments to try and prove that. So that's the red pill community itself in terms of like its definition. And if we're looking at its historical origins, the whole idea of the red pill itself originated from a 1999 movie called The Matrix. I'm pretty sure all of you watched The Matrix. I mean, where were you, man, when The Matrix was? Obviously, I wasn't born when it was created, but I watched it. It was the point when Neo, or one of the characters, gave the other character, asked them to either pick the red pill or the blue pill and explain the differences between the two. And the whole point of the red pill is that it essentially or effectively what it does is it wakes you up to reality. That's the whole premise of the red pill. So the argument of the red pill community is that there is something inherently hideous about women that most men do not know based off our social conditioning. So we might have the perception or the illusion that women might be incredibly polite. However, the red pill community argues that when you take the red pill, you start to see women for what they really are, as opposed to, instead of being these innocent individuals, but rather promiscuous and hypergamous, basically. Right, that's one of the premises of their argument, and obviously their historical origins as well. I'm not gonna lie, as a male, naturally people might think I might subscribe to the ideology, right? And the red pill community is a broken clock, right? And the thing about a broken clock is that even a broken clock is right twice a day. So the red pill community, independent of their toxicity and their misleading and radical ideologies, sometimes some of the things that they say about gender norms and gender dynamics at its foundation are objectively true. For example, female hypergamy it is true. Women do have a proclivity or tendency of dating across or higher up the socioeconomic ladder. That's factually true. That is factually from a historical perspective, but it is also true from a biological perspective that women generally have a tendency of dating up or higher up the dominance hierarchy, meaning that women do prefer a guy who makes more than them, a guy who's above them in the hierarchy, right? A guy that makes significantly more money than themselves. That's what they prefer. Now, that doesn't mean that that's the individual that they're going to end up with, but on average, women do prefer a guy who's essentially better than they are, a guy that's taller than them, right? A guy that's more intelligent than them, a guy that's like literally in every metric, they just want to look up to the man. That's a fact. But the problem is that the red pill community has blown it out of proportion. They argue that that's basically it. Like, if you're a guy and you're not making much, you're not higher up the social ladder or the economic ladder or the political ladder, then you've got no opportunity, you've got no chance of dating, which is objectively not true. So part of their argument is true, which is that women tend to date up. But another part of their argument is blown out of proportion, meaning that if you're a guy who's not higher up the hierarchy, effectively you're not going to get any relationships. That's objectively untrue. And what we have to do is we really have to acknowledge the core beliefs of the red pill community. One of the key components to their argument is to do with feminism and the notion that feminism has gone too far in a sense that it's deviated from what it was in terms of its foundational definition and its foundational understanding, and that the whole feminist movement and ideologies morphed into something akin to the hatred of men. Now, I can't comment on that, to be honest, because at the end of the day, it's a theory, right? Different people have their different perspectives. But independent of their perspective, the main argument for feminism is equality, social equality, economic equality, and political equality between the genders. That is the foundational understanding of feminism. And to this day, that's what most feminists strive for, right? So there might be feminist people that might, move slightly up the radar, and their feminism might be built off of hatred of men. But in the vast majority of cases, most feminism is built off of equality rather than hatred towards men. But the things that you would hear within their arguments is female hypergamy, which I've explained earlier, argues that women have a high proclivity or tendency to dating across or higher up the social economic ladder, meaning that women generally prefer a guy who is more financially successful than themselves, or a guy who's significantly more educated than them. That's why you might go on dating apps and you might see that the vast majority of women would say they prefer a guy who is a certain height or a guy that makes a certain amount of money. So effectively, the woman is not dating down, she's dating up, right? So that's the whole argument of the hypergamy theory, which is actually objectively true. Like, generally speaking, women do want to date a guy who's better than them in every metric. However, their argument is completely blown out of proportion and over-exaggerated in a sense that they argue that in every scenario, the woman prefers a guy better than her, which is just not true. Sometimes women cannot find a guy better than them, but in the vast majority of cases, they find a guy on the same level as themselves, which is more realistic. And most women end up settling for a guy on exactly the same level as themselves on the social and economic ladder, which is the correct way. One of their theories is that masculinity is under attack. Now, this is not entirely wrong, but it's just one of those things that are partially true, but not entirely true. As much as there's a group of men that are under attack in terms of like masculinity, and there are people that are arguing about toxic masculinity and all that stuff in places where it doesn't exist. And then obviously we live in a society where sometimes as a guy, you might feel like you're being blamed for essentially everything that goes on in this world, right? It's the fault of the men. And you might have the inkling or like the feeling that, well, as much as there's a lot of things that might be the result of men in terms of like things that are bad. However, a lot of things that we enjoy in society today in terms of like infrastructure, safety, and a lot of things that we enjoy in our society is because of men too. And I can give you an example. I remember once me and some of my friends, we was coming from a place called Brighton late at night, and like we was on a motorway and it was raining and later it started snowing, but there was a construction that was supposed to be done on the roads, on the particular motorway. Guess what? There was not a single woman. That walk was being done by predominantly men. Not a single woman was present. So obviously, I can see why a guy would complain about masculinity being under attack, because men do the work and there's never any appreciation, right? It's normally criticism constantly, to the point that women argue that they don't need men. But the reason why women could make the argument they don't need men is because men created the safety and the infrastructure and the privileges that a lot of women enjoy, to the point that they can wake up and say, we don't need men anymore. But you watch when shit hits the fan, then all of a sudden they need men, and women naturally would go back to their submissive state. That is true. However, again, with many of these arguments, it's over exaggerated, to the point that it becomes incredibly toxic and misogynistic. That's fundamentally the reality. And obviously, one of their key sort of like ideology is about, like being a man of game, knowing how to appeal to women, how to attract women, and all that kind of stuff, which there's nothing inherently wrong with it, but it gets to a point where it does become a toxic ideology as well. So what caused the rise of the red pill community? The rise of the red pill community. So what caused the rise of the red pill community is obviously the backlash against feminism, right? There's this whole movement around 2016, 2017, when, the likes of Jordan Peterson came into the picture, when like he refused to call that, transgender like individual the right pronouns. And that led to a lot of backlash. And then obviously that led to the rise of the right-wing community, and obviously the stance against feminism and all that kind of stuff. That was effectively the birth of the community, really. And its successes can primarily be traced to its hatred of the feminist ideology and movement, really. So that's how they gain their clout. And then obviously, just like I've mentioned with feminism, there was other factors like cultural shifts that we had, such as the Me Too movement, which obviously tried to acknowledge and address and hold to account, people that were responsible for, sexually assaulting women and rape and all that kind of stuff, basically. Now, the red pill community somewhat saw the ideology of the Me Too movement as being extremely toxic. So they became the counterforce to the Me Too movement, basically. So these are some of the other factors to the rise of the red pill community. The rise of the community happens, they were doing really well in terms of, like views on social media, until they started getting banned we started seeing their downfall later on, somewhere around 2020, Reddit. So they were banned on Reddit in 2020. And after they were banned on Reddit, other platforms like YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok started banning segments of the red pill community, to the point that it started becoming difficult to sort of like interact or sort of like find red pill communities within different social media platforms, basically. So that's effectively their downfall, right? But I mean, I would argue that based off of the toxicity of the ideology, um, despite some of the things that they say being fundamentally true, however, the ideology itself is toxic and foundationally built on a lie. So the banning or the deplatforming of the ideology and the people behind it itself, fundamentally, I agree with, to be honest, because I believe there's an incredibly toxic ideology, and overall could do more harm to communities than it does good, to be honest. So yeah, I think they deserve what they got. So, ladies and gentlemen, I want to know your thoughts on the Red Pill community. What do you think about them? What's your perspective on them? And I appreciate you lot obviously watching the video. Make sure to smash the like button down below, comment and subscribe, and I'll see you later. Peace.